The blood on the imported marble wasn't the problem. The problem was that the men sent to kill him were already dead. Arthur watched the tall, quiet woman wipe a combat knife on a linen napkin. He hadn't just hired a bodyguard. He had hired an executioner. Arthur Cole did not look like a man who owned half the Port Authority and all of the underground gambling rings in the tri-state area. He looked like a man who desperately needed 4 hours of uninterrupted sleep. He sat behind a massive desk of reclaimed oak, rubbing the bridge of his nose. The air in his office smelled of ozone and stale espresso. Rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows, blurring the city skyline into streaks of grey and bruised purple. He was a Korean immigrant's son who had clawed his way to the top of a very white, very old-money criminal food chain. He had adopted a Western name to get his foot in the door, and then he had broken the door off its hinges. But gravity was catching up. 3 days ago, a car bomb had taken out his lead security detail and left Arthur with a deep gash along his ribs and a searing headache that refused to quit. He needed new blood. He needed a shield. "Next," Arthur said, his voice barely rising above the hum of the air conditioner. His lieutenant, a broad-shouldered man named Leo, opened the heavy oak doors. "Candidate 4, Simone Hayes." She walked in. Arthur looked up, his dark eyes narrowing. Simone didn't strut, and she didn't shrink. She just occupied space with a heavy, undeniable permanence. She was a black woman in her early 30s, tall, dressed in a charcoal suit that was tailored for movement, not fashion. No heels. She wore scuffed rubber-soled Oxfords. Her dark hair was pulled back into a severe utilitarian braid. She didn't look at Arthur first. She looked at the room. Arthur watched her eyes track. She checked the ventilation grate. She checked the gap between the window frames. She checked Leo's hands, then the placement of Arthur's coffee cup, before finally letting her gaze settle on Arthur's face. "Have a seat, Ms. Hayes," Arthur said. She didn't sit. "I prefer to stand." Her voice was a low, resonant alto. No nervous pitch, no deference. Arthur leaned back, testing the pull of the stitches in his side. He suppressed a wince. "You read the listing. You know who I am. You know the risks." "I know you bleed like anyone else," Simone said flatly. "And right now you're bleeding from your lower left abdomen. You're leaning to the right to compensate. Your current detail let a proximity explosive get within 10 feet of your sedan." Leo bristled, stepping forward. "Watch your mouth. Stop." Arthur raised a hand, silencing Leo. He looked at Simone with a flicker of genuine interest. It was the first time all morning he felt awake. The previous candidates had boasted about their kill counts in Fallujah or their time in private military companies. They had puffed out their chests. Simone was completely still. "You think you can do better?" Arthur asked. "I know I can," Simone replied. She reached into her pocket. Leo's hand flew to his holster, drawing his weapon in a fraction of a second. "Hands where I can see them." Simone didn't flinch. She pulled out a small metallic disc, no larger than a watch battery, and tossed it onto Arthur's desk. It landed with a faint click. Arthur stared at it. "What is that?" "A high-frequency audio transmitter," Simone said. "I pulled it from the underside of the guest chair in your waiting room. Whoever planted it has been listening to your last 3 interviews. If I had to guess, I'd say they know your current perimeter is weak, and they know you're desperate." Arthur's jaw tightened. He glanced at Leo, whose face had gone pale. His own safe house, his own waiting room. The paranoia that had been simmering in his gut finally boiled over. He looked back at Simone. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't waiting for applause. She was simply stating facts. "Who do you work for, Simone?" Arthur asked, his tone dropping an octave. "Myself," she said. "I did a stint in corporate extraction. Then I did some private work. Now I'm looking for a steady paycheck. The ad said 50,000 a month plus expenses. I want 60, and I pick my own gear. Arthur studied her face. There was a profound exhaustion in her eyes, a mirror to his own, but beneath it lay a bedrock of cold, hard competence. He didn't know her. He didn't know if she was a plant. But instinct, the same instinct that had kept him alive when rival bosses were trying to cut his throat in back alleys, screamed at him to keep her close. "Leo," Arthur said, not breaking eye contact with Simone. "Clear my schedule, and get the security sweep team up here, now." "Boss, you can't be serious," Leo hissed. "We don't know her." "I said do it," Arthur snapped. Leo swallowed hard, holstering his weapon, and practically ran out of the room. Arthur stood up slowly. The pain in his ribs flared, a hot wire pulling tight. He walked around the desk, stopping a few feet from Simone. He was a tall man, but he only had an inch on her. "You start today," Arthur said. 60,000. But if you miss a bug or a wire or a shooter, you won't live to spend it." Simone met his stare. "If I miss a shooter, Mr. Cole, we'll both be dead. It's in my best interest to keep you breathing." Arthur exhaled a breath he didn't know he was holding. "Good, because we have a meeting in an hour, and I have a feeling the people we're meeting are the ones who planted that bug." The meatpacking district smelled of salt rust and old blood. Arthur hated it here. It was a relic of a bygone era, all corrugated steel and dripping condensation. He stood in the center of an empty freezer room, the temperature hovering just above freezing. His breath plumed in the air. He was supposed to be meeting with the Rossi brothers to renegotiate a shipping route. It was a standard sit-down, but the Rossi brothers were 20 minutes late. Simone stood 2 paces behind him and 1 pace to the right, the optimal position for a rapid intercept. She hadn't said a word since they left the car. She just watched the heavy metal doors, her hands hanging loosely at her sides. "They're not coming," Arthur said, pulling his wool coat tighter around his shoulders. "It's a wash. Let's go." "Wait," Simone said. Her voice was a whisper, but it cut through the hum of the refrigeration units like a blade. Arthur stopped. "What?" "The compressors," Simone murmured, her eyes tracking the ceiling. "They just shut off. All of them, at the exact same time." Arthur listened. She was right. The heavy, vibrating hum that had filled the room was gone. The silence that replaced it was suffocating. "They're locking us in?" Arthur asked, reaching into his coat for his sidearm. "No," Simone said. "They need it quiet, so they can hear us move." She stepped in front of him. In one fluid motion, she drew a compact, matte black handgun from her shoulder holster. The heavy iron door at the far end of the freezer shrieked open. 3 men stepped through. They didn't wear suits. They wore dark tactical gear, heavy vests and balaclavas. They carried suppressed submachine guns. This wasn't a message. It was an extermination. "Get behind the meat racks now," Simone ordered. Arthur didn't argue. He dove behind a row of frozen hanging cattle carcasses just as the first muted thwip-thwip-thwip of suppressed gunfire tore through the air. Bullets ripped into the frozen meat, sending chunks of icy flesh and bones splintering into the room. Arthur crouched, his breathing shallow, gripping his gun. He prepared to return fire, but before he could lean out, Simone moved. She didn't seek cover. She advanced. It wasn't reckless. It was calculated aggression. She moved at a low, predatory crouch, sliding across the frost-slicked concrete. The first shooter swung his weapon toward her. Simone fired twice. 2 sharp, deafening cracks echoed in the enclosed space. The shooter dropped 2 holes, punched cleanly through the center of his visor. The remaining 2 men pivoted, spraying bullets in an arc. Simone vaulted over a fallen pallet, the wood splintering into sawdust where she had just been. She landed in a roll, coming up directly at the feet of the second shooter. She didn't bother shooting. She drove the heel of her boot into the side of the man's knee. The joint snapped with a sickening crunch. As the man screamed and crumpled, Simone grabbed the barrel of his falling weapon, yanked him forward, and used his body as a shield, just as the third man opened fire. Bullets thudded into the human shield. Simone discarded the dead weight, raised her weapon, and put a single round through the third man's throat. He collapsed, clutching his neck, a wet, gurgling sound filling the frozen room. Arthur slowly stood up from behind the carcasses. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic rhythm. He kept his gun raised, scanning the room. "Clear," Simone said. She wasn't panting. Her chest rose and fell in measured, deliberate breaths. She walked over to the third man, kicking his weapon away, and watched him bleed out on the concrete. Her face was devoid of malice or triumph. It was just a day at the office. Suddenly the heavy door groaned again. A fourth man, massive and built like a freight train, charged into the room. He didn't have a gun. He had a rusted meat hook gripped in his massive fist. He saw his dead comrades and roared, charging straight at Simone. Arthur raised his gun, but he didn't have a clear shot. "Simone!" She turned. The man swung the heavy iron hook in a brutal, decapitating arc. Simone ducked underneath it. She stepped inside his guard, slipping past the massive swing. With her left hand, she grabbed the collar of his tactical vest to anchor him. With her right, she drove the butt of her gun directly into his face. Cartilage crunched. The man stumbled backward, blinded by his own blood, but he didn't fall. He swung blindly with his free hand, catching Simone in the ribs. The blow sent her sliding back 2 feet. She grunted, but she didn't lose her footing. The man lunged again. Simone dropped her gun. It was a tight quarters scramble now. She sidestepped his charge, grabbing his wrist as he passed. She twisted, using his own momentum against him, and drove her elbow sharply into the back of his neck. He crashed into a hanging beef carcass, sending it swinging wildly. Before he could recover, Simone drew the combat knife from the sheath at her waist. The man spun around, raising his hands. Simone stepped in close, parried his clumsy block, and drove the blade up under his jaw, straight into the brainstem. The man's eyes rolled back. His massive body went completely limp. Simone held him there for a second, letting the life drain out of him before ripping the blade free. The body hit the floor with a wet thud. Silence descended on the freezer again, save for the dripping of blood onto the frost-covered floor. Arthur walked out from behind the meat racks. He lowered his gun. He looked at the 4 bodies scattered across the concrete. He looked at the carnage. Then he looked at Simone. She was wiping the blade of her knife on the dead man's canvas vest. She had a smear of blood across her cheek. Her charcoal suit was ruined. She looked up at Arthur, sliding the knife back into its sheath. She picked up her handgun, checked the magazine, and holstered it. "We need to leave," Simone said, her voice steady. "They'll have a driver waiting outside, and if he heard the unsuppressed shots, he's either running or calling for backup." Arthur just stared at her. He had grown up in violence. He had ordered men killed. He had killed men himself. But he had never seen someone dismantle a hit squad with such cold mechanical efficiency. It wasn't a fight. It was a slaughter. And she had done it all without breaking a sweat. "Who did this?" Arthur asked, his voice rough. Simone knelt by the first man she had shot. She rummaged through his pockets and pulled out a burner phone. She tossed it to Arthur. "You're the boss," she said, finally letting a hint of exhaustion bleed into her tone. "You tell me." Arthur caught the phone. The screen was cracked, but it was functional. He knew instantly that the Rossi brothers hadn't ordered this. They were too cheap to hire professionals. This was someone else, someone with money. He looked back at Simone. She was watching the door, already planning their exit route. He realized then that the $60,000 a month was a bargain. "Let's go," Arthur said. They walked out of the freezer together, leaving the dead behind in the cold. Arthur's side burned, and his empire was clearly under siege. But as he watched Simone systematically clear the hallway, her gun raised her eyes, scanning the shadows, a strange, unfamiliar feeling settled over him. He felt safe. The safe house was a windowless basement beneath a defunct dry cleaner in Queens. It smelled of bleach, old dust, and copper. Arthur sat on a metal folding chair under a single, swaying, incandescent bulb. He had stripped off his ruined dress shirt. His left side was a canvas of ugly purple bruising, centered around a jagged laceration that had torn open during the freezer ambush. Blood trickled down his ribs, pooling at his waistband. Simone stood over him. She had discarded her ruined suit jacket and rolled up the sleeves of her white button-down. Her hands were encased in blue latex gloves. She held a curved suture needle and a bottle of iodine. "This is going to burn," she said. "Just do it," Arthur muttered, gripping the edges of the metal chair. She poured the iodine directly into the wound. Arthur's breath hitched. His knuckles went white, but he didn't make a sound. Simone worked quickly and without sympathy, threading the needle through his skin with the steady, mechanical rhythm of a seamstress repairing a torn hem. Arthur watched her face. It was a study in absolute concentration. "Where did you learn to stitch like that?" he asked, trying to distract himself from the sharp, pulling pain. "My father," Simone said, tying off a knot and snipping the thread. "He was a precinct medic, spent 30 years patching up gangbangers and cops who thought they were bulletproof." She wiped the excess iodine away with a gauze pad. "He taught me that blood all looks the same on the floor. Doesn't matter who you think you are." Arthur leaned back, breathing heavily. "Profound. Practical," Simone corrected. She stripped off the gloves and threw them in a metal bin. She walked over to the folding table against the wall, where the cracked burner phone from the freezer sat plugged into a laptop she had pulled from a duffel bag. For the last hour, she had been running a brute force decryption program on the device. The screen finally flashed green. Lines of text began cascading down the monitor. Arthur stood up, wincing as the fresh stitches pulled tight. He walked over and leaned against the table. "What do we have?" Simone tapped the screen. "A wire transfer. $500,000 deposited into a shell company in the Caymans. The authorization code attached to the routing number belongs to a trust fund." Arthur squinted at the screen. "Who's Charles Montgomery?" Arthur exhaled a slow, ragged breath. "Montgomery, the city commissioner. A man born into generational wealth, a fixture at charity galas, and a man who secretly controlled the zoning permits for every commercial dock in the city." Arthur had been paying Montgomery a heavy tax for 3 years, just to keep his legitimate shipping operations running. "Montgomery," Arthur said, the name tasting like ash. "He smiled in my face last week, drank my scotch, told me I was a credit to my people. He doesn't respect you," Simone said, flatly, her eyes scanning the data. "He sees you as a piggy bank, a street thug who managed to put on a nice suit. You're expanding, getting too big. He wants the ports for himself, and he doesn't want to buy you out. He wants to wipe you out." Arthur's jaw tightened. He knew the type. Men like Montgomery operated with a terrifying arrogance. They believed their bloodline and their badges gave them a divine right to take whatever they wanted, immune to the consequences that governed the rest of the world. "We hit him back," Arthur said, his voice cold. "Tonight, I'll make the calls. We gather the men." "No," Simone interrupted, turning to face him. "You don't send street muscle after a man like Montgomery. He owns the police chief. He owns the judges. If you attack his estate with a squad of shooters, you validate every prejudice he has about you. You become the rabid dog he claims you are, and he puts you down legally. Then what do you suggest I just let him bomb my cars and shoot up my meetings?" Simone turned back to the laptop. Her fingers flew across the keyboard. "Before I did corporate extraction, I worked as a forensic auditor for a private intelligence firm. I hunted hidden assets for people who made governments disappear. Montgomery is a trust fund kid playing gangster. He's sloppy. She hit a final key. A massive spreadsheet populated the screen. He thinks his money makes him untouchable. Simone said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. So we take the money. I just accessed the Cayman Shell Company. I'm routing the $500,000 he paid the hit squad, plus the rest of his liquid offshore assets, into an irrevocable trust for the city orphanage. And I'm forwarding his unredacted transaction ledgers, including the bribes he took from your rivals, to the IRS Criminal Investigation Division and the District Attorney's Office. Arthur stared at her, stunned. In 30 seconds, she had stripped a Titan of his armor. You just ruined him. Not yet, Simone said, closing the laptop. She picked up her handgun from the table and checked the chamber. He still has breathing privileges, and he needs to know exactly why they're being revoked. The Montgomery estate sat on a sprawling, gated property in the hills of Connecticut. It was a monument to old money and quiet cruelty, surrounded by manicured hedges and high-definition security cameras. It was 2 a.m. A heavy fog had rolled in off the sound, turning the grounds into a grey, ghostly landscape. Inside the main study, Charles Montgomery poured himself a glass of 20-year-old bourbon. He was a handsome man in his late 50s, with silver hair and the smug, relaxed posture of a man who had never lost a fight in his life. He took a sip of the bourbon. The heavy mahogany doors of his study clicked shut. Montgomery turned around. He expected to see his head of security. Instead, he saw a tall black woman in a dark turtleneck and tactical pants. She locked the heavy deadbolt. Montgomery froze the glass halfway to his mouth. He looked past her towards the hallway. Where is Miller? Where are my men? Sleeping, Simone said. Or bleeding. Depends on which floor they were stationed on. Montgomery lowered his glass. The shock faded, replaced instantly by a sneering, indignant rage. He looked at Simone, taking in her appearance, and his lip curled. Arthur Cole sent you. I suppose I shouldn't be surprised. He always was a coward, sends the help to do his dirty work. Simone walked slowly into the room. She didn't draw her weapon. He didn't send me. I brought him. The French doors leading to the balcony opened. Arthur stepped into the study, the cold fog swirling in behind him. He looked pale, favoring his left side, but his eyes were hard and completely devoid of mercy. Montgomery scoffed, setting his drink down on his desk. He leaned against the heavy oak wood, crossing his arms. He wasn't afraid. He was simply annoyed. Arthur. Montgomery said, shaking his head. You breaking into my home is a federal offense. You're a gutter rat playing out of your league. Do you know who I am? I can make one phone call and you and your hired help will disappear into a black site before sunrise. Make the call, Charles, Arthur said quietly. Montgomery smirked. He picked up his desk phone. He dialed a number. He waited. A recorded voice echoed from the receiver. The number you have reached has been disconnected. Montgomery frowned. He dialed another number. The same automated message. He grabbed his cell phone from his pocket, his thumb swiping aggressively at the screen. His banking app flashed an error code. Account frozen. Contact institution. The color began to drain from Montgomery's face. The smugness fractured. Your offshore accounts are empty. Charles, Simone said, stopping a few feet from his desk. Your shell companies have been liquidated, and the ledger detailing every bribe, extortion, and assassination you've ordered in the last 5 years is currently sitting in the inbox of 3 different federal judges. Montgomery dropped his phone. It clattered against the hardwood floor. He looked at Arthur, his chest heaving. The arrogant aristocrat was gone. In his place was a terrified, cornered animal. You can't do this, Montgomery stammered, his voice rising in panic. I am a commissioner. I come from a founding family. You are nothing. You're an immigrant street thug and a... He looked at Simone, his face twisting with venom. You're a nobody. Simone didn't blink. She stepped forward, her movement so fast Montgomery didn't even have time to flinch. She grabbed him by the lapels of his expensive silk dressing gown, lifted him off his feet, and slammed him backward onto the surface of his heavy oak desk. Crystal decanters shattered. Papers flew into the air. Montgomery gasped for breath, his hands grabbing uselessly at Simone's wrists. She pinned him there, leaning over him. The cold mechanical detachment was gone from her eyes. It was replaced by a terrifying, focused intensity. People like you, Simone whispered, her voice rough like dragged stone. You sit in your high towers. You build your little kingdoms on the backs of people you think are beneath you. You think the rules don't apply. You think you're untouchable. She leaned closer. Montgomery whimpered. You're not untouchable, Charles, Simone said. You're just soft. She released him. Montgomery scrambled backward across the desk, falling off the other side and crashing to the floor. He scrambled into the corner, clutching his knees, trembling violently. Arthur walked slowly around the desk. He looked down at the ruined, pathetic man who had tried to kill him. Arthur drew his gun. He pointed it at Montgomery's head. Montgomery squeezed his eyes shut, sobbing openly now, begging for his life. Arthur held the gun steady for a long moment. He felt the weight of it in his hand. He thought about the car bomb. He thought about the freezer. He thought about the decades he had spent fighting for every inch of respect in a world designed to keep him out. Then Arthur lowered the gun. He looked at Simone. He's not worth the bullet. The feds will be here in 10 minutes. Let him rot in a concrete box. Simone nodded. She turned her back on Montgomery, entirely dismissing him. It was the ultimate insult. She walked toward the French doors, stepping out into the cold fog. Arthur followed her. They walked away from the sprawling estate, leaving the broken commissioner weeping in his ruined study. The drive back to the city was quiet. The sun was just beginning to crest over the skyline, bleeding dull orange light into the grey morning. Arthur sat in the back of the SUV. Simone was in the front passenger seat, staring out the window at the passing city. You didn't have to stay, Arthur said, softly breaking the silence. After the freezer. You could have walked. You had your money. Simone didn't turn around right away. She watched the reflection of the city lights fading on the glass. I don't like bullies, Arthur, and I don't leave a job unfinished. She finally turned her head, looking at him over her shoulder. The exhaustion was there, heavy and real, but the guarded, impenetrable wall she had built during the interview had cracked just a fraction. Besides, Simone added a faint, weary smirk touching the corner of her mouth. Someone has to make sure you don't bleed out on your own furniture. Arthur looked at her. He saw the blood on her collar, the shadows under her eyes, and the quiet strength that anchored her to the earth. He didn't just see a bodyguard anymore. He saw an equal. He saw a partner. 60,000 a month, Arthur said, leaning his head back against the leather seat. I think you need a raise. Simone turned back to the window. We can negotiate. The car sped toward the rising sun. The war wasn't over. In their world, it never was. But as Arthur closed his eyes, listening to the steady, rhythmic breathing of the woman in the front seat, he realized he wasn't fighting alone anymore. Did you expect Simone to dismantle a corrupt empire with just a laptop and a right hook? If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button. We want to hear your thoughts. What was your favorite moment of karmic justice? Drop a comment below. Don't forget to share this with your friends and subscribe to the channel for more gritty, grounded storytelling. Hit the bell icon so you never miss a new chapter.